Hi. So this is part 2 of my sermon on childlike trust, and yeah, it'll make more sense if you watch the first video first if you haven't seen it yet, and you'll understand then why this guy is here. Well, maybe you won't really understand, because I'm not sure if he's going to say anything or not. Me neither. But he's here. Anyway, he's here to lend me moral support. So thank you very much, Mr. Policeman. Anyway, what we talked about in the first part of the video, because this sermon is so long it had to be 2 different videos, sorry about that. What we talked about in the first part of the video was what it's like to live without faith. Sort of this problem of doubt that people experience, we experience in our lives. And I wasn't talking about doubt in terms of kind of this intellectual way that we often think about faith and doubt, as if it was just a matter of getting all your beliefs straight and having orthodox doctrine, because that's not primarily what faith is about. What faith primarily is actually really a matter of the heart, and not as much a matter of the head, even though getting your beliefs right and having orthodox beliefs and all that kind of thing is helpful, and that's all part of it. But that's another sermon. What I wanted to say in this sermon is just to talk about how central that sort of that part of faith that is about, like I said, the heart. Right. So anyway, what we had talked about in terms of doubt was not about doubting whether God exists per se, but more about doubting that God really loves you. And that is the more important thing, because there are lots of people out there who believe that God exists, or say they believe that God exists, but even for those of us who really believe that, and those who call ourselves Christians, we don't always actually believe that we are loved by God, that we're forgiven by God, and that leads to just all kinds of fear driving our lives. So, alright, so yeah, go back and watch the first video if you don't know what I'm talking about, and you'll have some idea better, I hope, after hearing my longer explanation. So we looked at Abraham in the last video. We looked at this little story of Abraham that's in Hebrews chapter 11. And we were thinking about Abraham, and how Abraham is this example of faith. And we're going to come back to Abraham in a little bit, but I did want to say just a little bit more about how the faith that Abraham demonstrated, the faith that the Bible tells us about. Again, not so much about getting your beliefs right, but about trusting God, about believing God, and really doing what God asks you to do without fear, with confidence, sort of boldly stepping out to do these things that God asks of you. Which is what we think of when we think of Abraham. Abraham was called by God to go to a land that he had never been to before. And so that's sort of our picture of what faith is like. That God asks you to do something and you do it. You trust that God is going to take care of you. You trust that God has some kind of a purpose in mind, that God has a plan, that God is going to be there to catch you if you fall. So, alright, that's faith. And what I wanted to say more about that, because we talked a little bit about how when we don't have faith, when we have this kind of doubt and we're not really letting God's love into our hearts, we're not really trusting that God loves us, it leads to this worry, not just about the big things that could happen in our lives, that are realistic fears that we kind of add to by thinking, well, if I lost my job, then I would have no worth, or if I lost my health, then I would never be loved again. But it reaches even to just little mundane kind of things throughout our lives that we have some anxiety about. Like I said, things about like what we eat, or what other people think of us, whether other people are going to judge us for the things that we do, and so on. So, sorry, I don't have all my notes in front of me. I was thinking I'm going to be spontaneous as I preach this rest of this sermon, to let the Holy Spirit guide me and lead me as I'm talking. But I wanted to just to say a little bit more. I guess maybe one thing about this is it says in that verse 1 of Hebrews chapter 11 that faith is something that we believe in, that we trust in, even though we can't see it. even though it's invisible, even though we don't really know that it's there for sure in a, the scientific proof kind of a way. And so I wanted to just point out, I mean, what is it? That's kind of vague. Like, well, what is it? What is this thing that we believe in that we don't really know about? And you say, well, it's God, and you have kind of this philosophical proposition in your mind. But what it really is love. And it makes perfect sense that that would be something that you can't see, right? Because you can't really see love. That's not something that that you actually can point to or you can measure in an objective fashion. It's there's no way of proving that somebody actually loves you. You can point at people's actions and say, well, that proves that so-and-so loves me, or that's a demonstration of their love. But if you were, a rigorous scientist, then you could just reduce that all down to some kind of biological impulses that people have, and even acting in self-interest, ultimately in some way. And so this idea of love is really something that is invisible, that is not quantifiable, that we can't actually measure. And that, again, that's what faith is. It's about believing in love. It's believing in something that you can't measure, that you can't prove. It's a matter of faith. So, what this is, what's so important about this, why this makes a difference, is because you can live your life with so much greater peace and with so much less stress when you know that you really are loved by God, when you know that you don't have to be perfect, when you know that there's forgiveness for any mistake that you make, when you know that no matter what happens, you will be provided for, you'll be taken care of, that there's someone actually who loves you in this world that is orchestrating it all behind the scenes. And it's hard to describe because, like I said, we can agree to that concept in our minds, but it's another thing to actually let that love into our hearts. And so I want to just give you an opportunity to think for a second about this, because faith does make such a difference in our lives, and you can tell whether you have faith or how much faith you have, right? Because we all have some kind of faith in something. But you can tell how much faith you have by asking yourself, well, to what extent do I live with stress? And to what extent do I live with peace? Like with that profound kind of peace that comes from knowing, again, that you are loved. So you just think about that. Well, how much stress? How much peace? And you can ask yourself too, how do I look at the world? Do I see the world as being dangerous, as being full of threats, things that I have to take into account to protect myself from? Or do you wake up every morning saying, I think I'll make a snappy new day? Right? There's sort of this continuum. Is the world a scary kind of a place, or is the world just full of possibilities? An exciting place? And two, how do you make decisions? Do you make decisions that are more based on, again, assessing the threats, assessing the dangers, thinking, how am I going to protect myself? How am I going to keep from getting hurt? Or do you make decisions out of a sense of adventure? Out of a feeling of, wow, if I risk this much, this will be the payoff. This could be the potential gain that I could have. So that's sort of the difference. Like I said, that's the difference that faith, the kind of faith that is of the heart, not just like something in your head, is the difference it makes. And so having thought about that a little bit, and that kind of gives us an idea of what it means to live with faith, what is that like? I want to move on to talking about how do we increase our faith, right? Because, you don't live with, none of us lives with perfect peace, right? No, absolutely not. I doubt it. If you do, then you're like a saint or something, and so you probably don't need to watch this video. Except maybe then you can pray for me, and thank you very much for your prayers. But most of us, we do live with some stress. We do sometimes make decisions based on, our fears rather than based on a sense of trust and adventure. And so we need to figure out how to increase our faith. Yeah. you were going to say something?
Oh, yeah. Well, I was just going to say, there be no one that lives with 100% faith, but there's some people that live with 100% stress.
Yeah, 100% stress, yes. That, I think I know who you're talking about. But anyway, so how do we increase our faith? Good question. Well, we're gonna think about Abraham. So we already said that Abraham, he did what God asked him to, and that is basically it. That's basically the secret, as far as I know, to increasing your faith. And the first thing that's important to remember, before we talk a little bit more about that, is that Abraham, he didn't have perfect faith, right? Even though he didn't have perfect faith in the beginning, God called him, and he went, right? We know that he didn't trust God absolutely from the beginning, because later on in the story, after he's gone to the strange land, he and Sarah, they kind of got anxious that God was not giving them the son that they were supposed to have, and so they kind of took matters into their own hands, and Abraham had a son through another woman instead of through his wife. And so that was, that was not so trusting of Abraham. And so we know, right, he wasn't perfect. He messed up, and he did something that he wasn't supposed to. But in spite of that, in spite of the lack of faith that Abraham had, God still chose him, and God still honored the faith that he did have. Okay, so Abraham did, even though he doubted some, he still received this promise from God, and God didn't give up on him. So that's important for us to remember, is that God doesn't expect us to start out perfect. God knows all our weaknesses, knows all our frailties. God understands that. So you don't have to be perfect from the beginning. Don't expect that of yourself. Your faith is going to grow over time. But that's really kind of the key here, especially as we look at the story of Abraham, is that Abraham, God asked more of Abraham the more that Abraham trusted. And that's because Abraham's faith, as I see it, Abraham's faith increased every time that Abraham followed what God told him to do, listened to what God had to say, and then he acted according to God's commands. Then every time God asked a little bit more of him, and he was able to do more because his faith increased, because of the experience of having trusted God and having been provided for and having seen how God was still there for him. So first God calls Abraham to go to this strange land, and he does, and everything is okay there. He's not, attacked by enemies. He's not rejected. He's not impoverished or anything. He does well and prospers. And then God tells him to send away his only heir, because this child that he had from a woman other than his wife was the only possible heir that he had. And so this was an even bigger risk that God was asking of Abraham. So he asked him to go ahead and just trust God and send away his only heir. And so that was a bigger kind of asking from God than what happened before. And then after Abraham had done that, then Abraham had his son. And so, actually not then Abraham had his son, but then after Abraham's son was born, Abraham was told by God to give up his only son that was actually the child of his very own wife, who was the legitimate heir. And so it was the biggest sacrifice that God could possibly have asked, and in this case it didn't even make sense, because this was the heir that God had said he was giving to Abraham. And so this was the biggest leap of faith that Abraham had to take. And so it was only after God had asked for these things that were still very, very big, but even smaller than what he asked later on. That was when finally Abraham did this amazing act that was just greater than any other act of faith recorded in the Old Testament, I think. Anyway, and that's why Abraham is this example of faith, this classic example of faith for us. So what that means for us is, right, we have to learn by experience. We learn by experience that God really is taking care of us. We learn by experience that God really is there for us. And so what that means is you find those areas of your life where you don't have faith, right? Those places where you're doubting, because those are probably the places where God is going to be calling you to do something, to take a little step of faith toward Him. And once you take that little step of faith toward Him and God provides and God uses that to do something good in your life, then you will have increased faith, right? That will help you to increase your faith to know that you could trust enough to take the next step and to take the next step. And remember, Abraham was very old by the time that God asked this ultimate test of faith of him. And so, don't expect yourself to change overnight. Don't expect that this is something you can just accomplish instantly. It's something that takes a whole lifetime to achieve, and in Abraham's case, he lived more than just the regular lifetime he lived quite a long time. So basically, getting old, even though I know getting old is not always fun because your body sometimes stops working in the ways that it was supposed to, but one of the most wonderful things about it is that you have seen God's faithfulness. You have seen all the ways that God provides for you, that God takes care of you. You have so much more evidence that God really does love you, that there is forgiveness for your mistakes, and so on. Okay, so you learn by experience. That's kind of how it works. And so that's my advice on how we're going to learn to trust in God, just like Abraham. And, I think if there's anything else. Oh yeah, the other thing is that you already have a lot of experience. And so, even though, you may or may not be old, whoever you are that's listening to this video, and you may be middle-aged, whatever, you have some experience. And so that experience is something that you can draw on to give yourself strength and to trust and to know that God does care about you. So remember all the people who have loved you. Remember the times that you've made mistakes and you've been forgiven, or even times you've made mistakes and it turned out to be for the best anyway. It turned out that something good came of that God actually turned it around. And so that's, again, a way that you increase your faith is by remembering those stories of the ways that you've seen God's love for you already. Mr. Rogers is one of my people that I like to think of, because maybe, I don't know, there's people in all of our lives that we love and who've loved us, and sometimes even that could be a character on television who showed God's light in a way that was just amazing and beautiful. And so Mr. Rogers is a light to me and is an example to me of faith and of love for God and so on. So anyway, that was the sermon that I had, and next time we're going to talk about what about when you step out in faith and God doesn't catch you. What about then? And that should be interesting, right?
Oh yeah, sounds better than this sermon.
Oh!
This was pretty long.
Yes, I know. Sorry about that, but next time will be shorter, I promise.
Great.